Again, there are several figures in chapter 27 that are noteworthy that I would like to draw attention to, and a few key concepts that we can accredit to them. Firstly, I want to talk a little bit about Hegel. Now, Hegel is a very fascinating philosopher, and just to kind of give you a little bit of a timeline of his life, he was born in 1770, August 27th to be exact, 1770. He was born in Stuttgart, and he is in fact German. 1781, he has a severe bout of fever, which strikes his entire family, resulting in the death of his mother. 1788, he studies theology at Tübingen University, where he meets a couple of colleagues that were very influential. In 1793, after he graduated from Tübingen, he moves to Bern, Switzerland, to take up his post as a private tutor. In 1796, he gets a post tutoring in Frankfurt, Germany. 1799, his father dies, which leaves him with a small private income. In 1801, he becomes a junior lecturer at Jena University. 1806, Hegel finishes the Phenomenology of Mind as Napoleon wins the Battle of Jena. 1807, he becomes the editor of the Bamberger Zeitung. There's my German for you. Becomes headmaster in 1808 of the gymnasium in Nuremberg. 1811, he marries Marie von Tucher. 1812, publishes the first part of The Science of Logic, completed in 4 years. Let's see, 1817, he publishes the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences in outline. 1818, becomes professor of philosophy at the University of Berlin. 1821, publishes The Philosophy of Right. In 1830, deeply upset by riots going on in Berlin at the time, he is also that year appointed as rector of the University of Berlin, and he dies November 14th, 1831, from cholera, and that was in Berlin, which I've actually been to Berlin twice, and I have not actually gone anywhere to the historical sites to visit. But I will go back to Berlin, and I will actually attempt to find some of these historical places. So mark my words, I guess it's going down here in this lecture. Hegel's most important ideas were formed gradually in response to a number of issues in philosophy and often in response to historical events. Moreover, his language and approach were so heterodox that he has inspired as much controversy about the meaning of his position as about its adequacy. Hence, any summary will be as much a summary of the controversies as it would be to summarize his basic position on things. In fact, I really appreciate Hegel, but I think what is more notable is how Karl Marx, the founder, Karl Marx and Max Engels, they developed what we call communism. And Marx was a student of Hegel. And Hegel was an idealist at the time. And he said that reality is mind or idea out of which develop the process of nature, human history, and the organizations of institutions and society. Matter, for Hegel, was the least real of all things that existed. Now, again, this isn't a philosophy class proper. We do talk a lot about the philosophers because it's a part of the humanities. And so that concept might be pretty deep. But to Hegel, matter was the least real of all things that existed. And then Marx comes along and rejects the idealism of Hegel, and he turns Hegel's philosophy upside down and said that matter, not mind or ideas, is fundamental. And that goes on to be a very important part of communist thinking. In fact, it becomes part of the communist thinking in Russia. That becomes kind of the foundational idea, was Marxism. Now, these were pretty major ideas, to say the least. And with Hegel, philosophy became difficult. his dialectical method, which your text mentions, produced the most grandiose metaphysical system known to man. And again, metaphysics, I don't know if I've mentioned this along the way. Probably I have or haven't. I do in the 1301 course. But metaphysics deals with not the real physical world, just sort of the underpinning whatever's going on that's not in the physical world. So a lot of the way the world works, spiritual things, philosophical things that don't deal with reality. Religion typically has a position in metaphysics. For example, if you were to consider Kant, as I mentioned in another chapter, the metaphysics of morals, where how do we know what's right and wrong? Does it come from some sort of behind-the-scenes spiritual root, or is it something that we learn from society? And so Hegel conceded that he was actually difficult to understand. And so it's not just of our opinion to say that Hegel was difficult as a philosopher. He was actually quite difficult to comprehend. Now, Hegel's system included absolutely everything. And if you ever hear that statement when it comes to philosophy, most philosophers are trying to come up with what's a philosophical law or principle that explains everything. I mean, history, science, the world, nature, cosmology, the universe, which is a pretty grandiose idea that there could be one powerful philosophical underlying statement, which is basically what Hegel attempts to do. And then you've got Marx, who comes along and says, no, I've got a better idea. And Marx goes down in history as a sociologist or a political theorist, an idealist, far more than he goes down in history as being a philosopher. But Hegel's system, like I said, included everything, but the most vital element was what the book mentions as the dialectic method: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Now, this method sprung from Hegel's ambition to overcome the deficiencies of logic and ascended toward mind as the ultimate reality. His view of history as a process of humanity's self-realization ultimately inspired Marx to synthesize his philosophy of dialectical materialism. Okay, so Hegel is quite an interesting character. He definitely had quite a contribution in what he attempted to accomplish in his philosophy. And then moving along, we have Charles Darwin, who is a very fascinating character indeed, and quite the center of much controversy, to say the least, because of his theory of evolution and the tension that exists between creationism and evolution, which is an ongoing battle today. Charles Robert Darwin was born in 1809, and he lived until 1882. He was born in Shrewsbury, England. He was the son of a physician. As a naturalist, he won sponsors and government backing for an expedition on the military sailing ship, the HMS Beagle, where he made his famous observations on the differences in finches on the island, the Galapagos Islands in South America. He later used all that information that he had gathered to support his theory of evolution. It should be noted that he was not the first to come up with a theory of evolution. There was some other scientists that had come up with these ideas. He wasn't alone in that, but he did, in fact, have the loudest voice. He's most famous for his work on the origin of species in 1859, in which he suggested in the last lines of the first edition that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, therein life with its several powers have been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms, or into one from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. It's interesting because Darwin didn't shy away from that there was a God. And so, I mean, I think at the end of the day, we would consider him to be a kind of agnostic theist, necessarily leaning way far the other direction from organized religion. On page 520 of The Origin of Species, he also has a very interesting statement that he makes where he says outright, I see no good reason why the views given in this volume should shock the religious feelings of anyone. It is satisfactory, as showing how transient such impressions are, to remember that the greatest discovery ever made by man, namely the law of the attraction of gravity, was also attacked by, and he names a guy. But he goes on to say, a celebrated author and divine, someone that was popular in his day, went on to say that they had accepted the idea of evolution as a just and noble conception of the deity. To believe that God would create a few original forms capable of self-development in other and needful forms, as to believe that God required a fresh act of creation to supply the voids caused by the action of his laws. And so there's kind of this ongoing kind of woven into the text, this idea that God was, a real concept, that there was in fact a creator. And it wasn't necessarily, I guess Darwin's major point of contention would have been found in his disagreement with Christianity and his rejection of the Old Testament, and the criticism that it was not historical and things of that nature. And to this day, Darwin, when just to even say the name Darwin, invokes quite a bit of hostility at times in certain circles, and but we cannot deny that Darwin himself actually rejected Christianity. He rejected religion, and a lot of some scholars believe that was due to the fact that he lost his daughter, and that made him angry with God, and he made some commentary outside of course, his major work, The Origin of Species, but that was to the effect that he was giving up on this idea of God because he thought hell was unjust and things like that. And so I like to bring this topic up in this course because I think that any thoughtful human being should be able to look at this topic and at least be able to talk about it in a civil manner. And so we do, I try to bring one of the discussions for this course try to implement the discussion of, is it possible to believe in God and believe in evolution? And, I would say it would probably be impossible to be a biblical literalist, meaning you believe everything in the Bible is to be literally true, exactly what it says, and to be an evolutionist, unless you created some sort of, time-lapse theory that 7 days was 7 trillion years or something for God. That may be one way to reconcile it. But I would definitely say that his plan at the core, the fundamental principles of his theory are in opposition to the literal creation story in Genesis. However, Darwin did not reject that there might be or could be a God, and some people have even gone on to reconcile their belief in God and their belief in evolution. And of course, that's a decision you have to make as a human being. You might reject it all. Who knows? You might reject the whole God thing totally and say, who cares? It's none of my business, whatever. Not worried about it. You might think Darwin was crazy as well, whatever. But I like to, bring us this conversation up in discussion. It is important to acknowledge Darwin. We can't talk about the humanities. We cannot discuss history without acknowledging the key event that is Darwin's theory becoming popular. What he had to say about the origin of species was transformative. It changed the course of the world. It was a kind of reformation in thinking. If we thought that what took place in the 1500s concerning our understanding or humankind's understanding of the world, there's no way in the world we could even begin to neglect the way Darwin's theory changed the world, at least the way God was conceived, or even the human beings and the elevation of our status. And I think that's one of the main points of contention for creationists and theists and believers, or whatever you want to call them, is that if humankind is just one more species of mammal, some other animal, that we're not any more elevated intellectually, or that we don't have a soul or anything greater than what we see on the surface in the material world, and we're just as comparable to the dog down the street or a horse, people could begin to say, I could see why people would find that problematic for their worldview, because they would want to believe that they're as human beings, they're important, because God created them and made them special and in His image. And so I totally can understand the argument for sure the creationists hold. But moving right along, we will now talk a little bit about the Transcendentalists. And Transcendentalism is a pretty fascinating topic in this chapter that I wanted to pull to the surface and unpack a little bit. And again, it's as if we cannot get away from God talk in this course, or dealing, as you read through your chapters, it's inevitable that part of the humanities is this discussion of God and the understanding of God and nature and the creation, or whatever. So just a little bit about the Transcendentalists, and we'll bring this lecture to a close. Interestingly, Transcendentalism is not an easy term to define. In fact, there are so many different facets to this concept, and those who consider themselves to be Transcendentalists, it's quite complex, to say the least. I think we could probably attribute Ralph Waldo Emerson at one of the main Transcendentalists who ever attempted to define what it meant to be a Transcendentalist. And in a lecture he actually delivered at a Masonic temple in Boston in 1841, Emerson was quoted as saying that Transcendentalism among us is idealism as it appears in 1842. But then later on, he goes on to say that Transcendentalism is the Saturnalia, or excess of faith. Now, those don't really tell us very much about what that means, but you'd be difficult to get away from Transcendentalism without acknowledging that it is a theological idea. It's an idealistic concept for sure, but it was birthed out of kind of a theological break from what was going on at the time. And many of the folks that were considered Transcendentalists, they were, well, I guess you could call them Unitarian ministers, if anything. And particularly Emerson, George Ripley, Theodore Parker, James Freeman Clark, as well as many others. They were all Unitarian ministers who became prominent Transcendentalist lecturers, critics, and writers. Others, such as Margaret Fuller and Henry David Thoreau, came to Transcendentalism not through Unitarianism, but through literary and philosophical interest in exploring new forms and questions. So, Transcendentalism was a set of ideas that promoted a new understanding of the individual, his or her relationship to nature and society and the universe, and the importance of self-development. Self-knowledge was the key to education for the Transcendentalists in their focus on the individual as the source of and route to all knowledge. They rejected contemporary social mores that were anti-individualistic or encouraged social conformity, emphasizing instead this self-reliance and self-expression as their primary values. Transcendentalism was truly a matter of going beyond what was considered normal at that time in the 1800s. They assumed the ultimate truth of the spiritual nature of the universe was readily at hand, natural, and accessible to every human being, but you had to pursue it. And so Transcendentalism is, in fact, difficult to grasp. I'm not going to say it's not, because it encompasses such a broad description, but there is an affiliation with Asian religions. In fact, in your text, you see a selection of text from Emerson's Brahma, which deals with the Hindu religion. So we see this connection between Asian religions and some of the theological ideas of Transcendentalism. But again, it doesn't only deal with theological things. It also dealt with a lot of philosophical, literary, religious as well. But, it was heavily influenced by European and German Romanticism. And of course, this was a movement that was taking place in America, the United States. And so American Transcendentalism was more than a matter of transcendentalists merely seeing an affinity between their own thought and that of Asian religions, but in many ways it was a religious movement as it was a literary or philosophical movement. But as one scholar has noted, Transcendentalism was most certainly a 19th century phenomenon and a result of liberal Christianity and comparative religion mixed together. So it had a little bit of a throwback to the Puritan era, or the Puritan theology of its day, with the mixture of this Unitarian concept. And so it's difficult to nail down a solid definition of Transcendentalism. But there you go. But whatever Transcendentalism was, or is, it was never suited to institutionalizing. It gave birth to no academy. It flourished in no college or seminary. It had two collective expressions during its popularity, and that was the Transcendentalist Club and a magazine called The Dial. But, the last meeting of the club was in 1840, the year The Dial was founded. For better or worse, American Transcendentalism was uncohesive, preferring to unravel rather than compromise its belief in the sovereign worth of each separate strand of yarn, so to speak. So there we have it, Transcendentalism. Maybe that added some confusion, maybe that added some clarity, but as you'll see, the explanation in your text is pretty good, but I wanted to talk a little bit about it because it's such a unique manifestation that I felt it was worthy of some attention. So that brings this brief discussion of some things from chapter 27 to a close as we looked at Hegel and Darwin and some of their ideas, and then as we had a little bit of discussion here concerning the Transcendentalists. But that does, in fact, bring the chapter 27 lecture to a close.